to the workshop in the history of material text. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in the English department, and I organized the seminar along with John Pollack of the Kislak Center, Jerry Singerman, humanities editor emeritus at Penn Press, Priya Nambrath, who's the Bristol-Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text. I'll just remind those of you on Zoom to mute yourself for now, but do use the raise hand function during Q&A if you'd like to ask your question live, or you can put it in the chat, which Priya will be monitoring. I'm going to share a little PowerPoint because you need to let me share. As you know, the seminar is now in its 34th year. It began in January of 1993. And for a long time, our records of the seminar extended back only as far as the fall of 96, when we had email history. Before that, Peter Stalybras, the founder, remembered placing paper slips with the details of each lecture in everyone's mailboxes in Bennett Hall. But we didn't have that record.
Before it was Fisher Bennett Hall.
It was just Bennett Hall. But just this past week, Penn PhD Carolyn Jacobson, now at Grinnell College, emailed us with a record of talks from spring 93, fall 93, and spring 94, gathered from the material text of her old notebook from those days. So we now have speakers and sometimes titles for those semesters. When this seminar seems to have been known simply as the library workshop, or later history of the book. And it turns out that the first ever speaker at this workshop appears to have been Vicky Mahaffey, the scholar of James Joyce and much else, on January 25th, 1993.
Hold on.
Here's the record of the first ever material text talk in Carolyn Jacobson's planner, 1993-94 Penn planner, which was given by Vicky Mahaffey on January 25th. Peter was slotted to give the second talk on February 1st, and Margreta de Grazia the third on February 8th, but it looks from Carolyn's notes that something went wrong with scheduling right from the start. This will not surprise anyone who's undertaken logistics with Peter. And February 1 was scratched. Peter gave the second workshop on February 8, and Margreta instead closed out the semester on April 26th. We also learned that the first ever talk by someone not affiliated with Penn seems to have been Randy McLeod on November 22nd, 1993. And thanks to Carolyn, we also have this wonderful material text, the earliest semester schedule we've located, the paper version of the first email you all received from the Bristol-Schoenberg Fellow each semester. And Jim English closed out that semester, although Carolyn had more important things on her mind that week with the first year qualifying exam coming up the next day on the Tuesday.
That semester, Liliana ran.
So it was organized.
And there was some heavy hitters.
And the nice graphic on the border there. That's
very nice. So you can find this information has now been put in the database on our website, pennmaterialtext.org. And you can see the schedules for the full schedules for those semesters, though in many cases we have only speaker and not title. We don't have records for the academic year 1994-95, though. So if you, Carolyn's planner from 94-95, she reports, is almost completely blank. I must have been keeping track of my schedule in some other way. So if you have 94-95, anyone out there, please let us know. That would complete our records. Okay, tonight, 33 years later, we're very happy to welcome Tina Lupton to the workshop. Tina last presented to this group in September of 2021, as we were finally able to hold seminars in person again. I think you were one of the early in-person ones again after the COVID virtual year. You were in person. I remember that. Ben was virtual.
Ben was virtual, and I was sitting here with
a mask.
Oh yeah.
In that talk, she presented with her collaborator Ben Davies on their project on reading fiction during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has now become an important book. I think called Reading Novels During the COVID-19 Pandemic, which won the British Society for Contemporary Literature and Monograph Prize. That book on very contemporary novel reading is a sort of sequel or a diptych with her groundbreaking 2018 book, Reading in the Making of Time, which looked at readers of 18th century novels and their experience of time, work, and leisure. She's currently working on a new project that continues her interest in those questions from the 18th century to the present, when writing doesn't work. She's also written a memoir of how her own reading, teaching, and life have intersected, called Love in the Novel, published by Profile Books in 2022. Tina earned her PhD just up I-95 at Rutgers, and she's taught at the University of Michigan, University of Warwick, where she directed the Humanities Research Center, the University of Copenhagen, where she was head of the School of Modern Languages, and Notre Dame, before joining us this year as a visiting professor. And next year, she'll begin as the Bewley Professor of English at Rutgers, returning to where she began her postgraduate career. Tonight, she'll present from the new book in progress on When Writing Isn't Work, Ronald Fraser, the New Left Review, and the Work Essays. So please welcome her back to the workshop.
Thanks, Zach, and it's nice to be here. Okay, so I'm beginning in material text tradition with an object, but it's going to take a little while to describe this object. The thing that I want to do, first of all, is to pass around an actual thing, which is a copy of the New Left Review from 1969. So I'm just going to pass this round, and I'll tell you about it as I pass it around, why I'm passing this one round. So this is not a very mysterious object, certainly by the standards of this seminar. Most of you, maybe all of you, will know what the New Left Review is. It began in 1962 in London, and it's still going today. In all these years, under different editorial teams, it's remained the flagship venue in the UK for intellectual left-wing discussion. In the years that I'm going to talk about, from 1964 to 1969, the editor-in-chief was Perry Anderson, and the editorial board included Gareth Stedman-Jones, Juliet Mitchell, Robin Blackburn, Fred Halliday, and Tom Nairn, all of whom went on to become senior Marxist political philosophers and academics. Ronald Fraser, a former journalist, had also joined this team as a success and became a successful financial manager and member of the journal's editorial masthead. In the hands of Ronald Fraser and the gang that I've just named, the journal recovered from its very first financially shaky years, and it became the launching pad for New Left Review books, now Verso books, which most of you will also know about, and settled into the robust platform for academic thought and debate that it remains today. So I'm not going to go very deep into the political mandate of the journal, but because the series of essays that I want to talk about today owes much to this context, it's worth saying just a few words about the debates within British Marxism at this time. The New Left Review began as an amalgam of different branches of British Marxism. Under the early influence of Stuart Hall and E.P. Thompson, it was committed to promoting the long history of British working class culture and to publishing the views and histories of British workers. But it veered quickly into commentary on communism in an international context. When the journal passed in 1964 to Anderson, it became more explicitly the expression of left-wing intellectual discourse, informed by continental Marxism, but geared towards the study of British socialism as a movement. These rifts within British Marxism at the time were by no means absolute, but it did mark a shift in publishing priorities at the New Left Review. The years I'm interested in saw a slew of translations of Gramsci and Benjamin, and the introduction of Althusser and Lacan to British readers, for instance. And it saw a distancing from the British trade union movement and from the British Labour Party as sites of interest. In 1966, the New Left Review also published Juliet Mitchell's iconic feminist statement, about the long history of the women's movement from 1968 onwards. There was also a real shift towards looking at the student movement in the journal. This is all background to the pieces that I want to describe today, the work essays. So the slide that's up there now, I don't know if it looks alarmingly small, but I hope that all you need to see from this really is the list of the essays that appeared in this run between 64 and 69. The series, and maybe if you can't, for those here in the room, if you can't read them, I can just quickly go through what they are. So there's one called Factory Money, Factory Time were the first ones. Producing the News, Selling for a Living was about a salesman. The Night Watchman, Primary School, Secondary Modern, that's about secondary teacher. Writing the Ads, On the Dole, At the Office, The Manager, The Print Jungle, White Overalls, On the Line, The Housewife, The Signal Woman, The Railway Technician, The Steelman, The Laboratory Technician, The Scenic Artist, The Convener, The Publisher, The Guard Underground, and The Toolmaker, which appeared in the final edition, the one that you've got in your hands. So this series of essays was Ronald Fraser's idea. He'd come to the journal as a friend of Andre Gortz, who was at the time the sort of primary thinker about the future and status of work. And the series fed into the popularity of that theme as people were thinking about, people were thinking and talking about in the mid-60s. In his obituary for Ronald Fraser in 2012, Perry Anderson credits Fraser with saving the journal economically, allowing it to exist, as he puts it, partly through the innovative design and shaping of this work series. The run of essays spread across almost every review. You can see there's a couple of gaps before it finally ended, starting in issue 31 in 1965 and ending in 1969 with issue number 53, which is the one you've got. The essays themselves are first-person reports on these different professional occupations. They're written in lucid and often beautifully descriptive prose by the people in the professions that I've just read out. Such accounts, the collective editorial statement of announcing the series suggests, constitute a revisiting for the 20th century of Marx's argument that all work under capitalism is a site of alienation. Have work relations changed significantly? Is the worker now at home in his work? Has work become a free, creative activity? Or is it still a means to satisfy needs outside of work, a forced activity whose purpose and product lies beyond the worker in a system he does not control? Rather than looking for direct answers to these questions, the editors are concerned, they claim, with, quote, the feeling of work as it modifies and shapes people's experience of life, their relation with others, their leisure, their aspirations. Stressing the diversity of experiences represented and the fact that no one style has been imposed on these pieces, and inviting readers to write down and share their own experiences, the editors launched the series as provoking questions rather than delivering answers about what work is. I'm interested in this presentation, as you'll see, mostly in how these pieces were written, but I do want to give you a flavour of them. So here's a sample from 1967 piece, On the Line, in which BS, at this point only identified as BS, describes the monotony of working in a car factory. My work comes to me in a completely automatic way, in the gestures of an automaton. With a rag wrapped around my eyes, I could still do it, and could do dozens before I realized that I'd done any at all. But underneath this, my mind never stops working. It lives by itself. Some call it dreaming, and if so, I am dreaming all day long, 5 days a week. I dream, he goes on, I am a painter painting great pictures full of vivid, outlandish colours. One day last week, I found myself dreaming I was a grave digger, my mind turning up soil and roots while my body was panel beating a hood. Some days I'm a hired assassin or settling all problems in some clockwork and dreamlike revolution, or I'm writing a book about the dreams I'm dreaming, or about factory thoughts running through my head if I am neither doing one thing nor the other. I'm just going to throw these examples at you. There's two more to come. So here's a passage from the 1965 essay, The Night Watchman, where the author describes himself standing at dawn after a night working in a warehouse, clutching a low-tiled roof in a state of delirious fatigue. Dimly, I began to think of all the other hands that must have touched the tile 40 or 50 years before. It had been carried there, lifted up and put down many times before the final effort of setting it in place. From the quarry where it had first fallen as part of a crude mass, a human tide had borne it here, a long, unwilling wave of effort which had fallen away and vanished, too small to be saved from nothingness by any record or memory. I turned and looked across the thousands of tiles in the dawn light. They mean a tiredness, an effort, a loss, which I could not bear to think of and yet was forced to think of, as if what was inside of me had suddenly become a microcosmic drop in the ocean they represented, and I was helpless to do anything but drift. The last example here comes from The Housewife, where the author, speaking of life at home with a 2-year-old, Carl, in an interregnum in her years as a university student, writes, "It is constantly niggling not only to be doing jobs that require so little valuable effort, but also jobs which are mainly concerned with simply keeping level with natural processes. Cleaning jobs, whether of objects or for people, which once done are not done for good and will have to be done over and over again, just as if I had not already made the effort the next day or even within a few hours. There is something so negative about this role that society heaps entirely onto the shoulders of women, that of making sure things do not get dirty and people do not get unhealthy." Now, I'm giving you these examples to showcase how strong the language and the thinking behind these essays is. You'll see in a minute why this matters materially. But it's also worth noting the way Fraser was trying with the series to showcase the limits of meaningless work, even as he suggested the basic quest for meaning that most people brought to their involvement with the world. In Marxist terms, this was a progressive rather than a revolutionary ambition, but it supported the newly moderate stand of the journal as a bridge between these different camps of Marxism. In this room, it's also worth noting how many of the jobs described in the series have to do with the changing fortunes of publishing and printing and paperwork. There's an essay on book publishing and another on printing the news, and one on printing itself, and 2 on office work. In the print jungle, the author describes the unskilled work of bundling magazines, counting them, tying them up for dispatch, mainly shilling paperback libraries and a few specialized trade journals. At other times, I'm in trimming or on a combination machine with half a dozen other men knocking up work for the guillotine, which is very monotonous, but without which a magazine wouldn't be presentable to the public. But then at the other end of the spectrum, the publisher is just as critical of his work in an industry that's considered glamorous by outsiders. He says, "I'm writing this piece at home, having been off work for a day with severe eye strain, through having read badly typed 3rd or 4th carbons of various manuscripts for the whole of last Saturday and Sunday. It is rare for editors to have time to sit down and read in the office. What, reading? Nothing to do?" is a familiar comment from colleagues. How do I spend my office hours? Answering innumerable letters from authors, agents, a quite unnecessary evil if all publishers did their jobs properly, book buyers, or more probably borrowers, asking when such and such a book will be published, at what price, discussing projects for non-fiction works with potential authors or writers on the list starved of subjects for their next books, reading innumerable magazines and newspapers, picking out likely ideas for books and possible authors, catching up on reviews, negotiating foreign film rights, serial rights, answering complaints about misprints, answering letters from people demanding to know why this book has not been published, and this book has, visiting universities through the country, trying to put under contract before anyone else does the brightest young academics, lunching literary editors and reviewers, liaising with the other departments in the firm, discussing for every individual book, binding, illustrations, typeface, number of copies to be printed, jacket, copyright problems, libel price, publication date, soothing a translator you've insulted by saying she may be the greatest expert in the world on her language, but she obviously doesn't begin to recognize a decent English sentence, persuading your accounts department to advance money to improvident and impecunious authors. Oh, and actually editing manuscripts. So before I move on to the form of these essays, let me just sum up by saying what I want to note at the level of content, which is the essays were, number one, political in the sense that they played into the transition of the journal as a publication that straddled the difference between what it meant for a socialist publication to publish the voices of workers and one that would argue on their behalf more theoretically. As speech acts, the essays complicate what it means to write as a worker and whether work was something to be overcome, to be valued, or to be improved. The series brought workers into the journal by expanding what it meant to think of a worker in the first place. Revolutionary, and they were my second point is that they were revolutionary in that they offered vivid descriptions of everyday life and real insight into new workplaces that were dying and ones that were coming into being. In this sense, they kept pace with a new kind of documentary realism and ethnography of the 1960s, much of which peeks behind the doors of factories and slums and printing presses, and which also informs aspects of book history as an emergent field. And yet, now I come to my central point. These essays were also notable on another count, which is that they were written mostly by people not employed in jobs that called for or justified their being written so well, and whose accounts of work do little to help us imagine how they found time and energy to write these essays in the first place. These essays raise, in other words, a fairly basic question, which is that of how they came to be, in what relation they stood to the journal itself and to the jobs they describe. I'll say up front that although I've done a few interviews on this count, I don't have answers to exactly the process that Fraser used to find or corral his writers. I do know that he didn't pay them for the initial contributions, although they did get a share, obviously, of the collections that I'll talk about in a minute. But there are some other ways to contextualize that process that Fraser undertook of getting workers to write with such depth about their own non-literary jobs, about the signal boxes and factories and printing presses in which they spent their days and nights. The 1960s, as the brief history I've given of the New Left Review suggests, crackles in many ways with the challenge of getting actual workers to speak to their own cause. This was an issue for those involved, for instance, in the largely middle-class women's liberation movement, and for those thinking about Britain's legacy as a post-colonial power. It was of little use to acknowledge patriarchy and imperialism if its victims were not given a way to speak back to the centre. This challenge was being methodologically met on several levels by the use of public media programming, but also through ethnographic studies and oral histories and documentaries. In Britain, for instance, members of the women's liberation movement made the documentary Night Cleaners in 1972, interviewing women whose double shifts as housewives and cleaners in big office buildings in London excluded them from even their own labour movement. The writer Nell Dunn wrote her 1965 Talking to Women, based on her ethnographic experiences of life amongst working women in the East End of London. And Philip Donnellan focused in his documentaries on the 1960s migrant Irish workers in England, representing them in their own words, describing the difficult work conditions that they endured. And Selma James, famous now as campaigner of the Wages for Housework movement in England, had a BBC radio show in which she spoke to working women who she brought in to interview. Ronald Fraser himself became a celebrated oral historian in the 1970s, beyond the time of the story I'm telling, publishing an oral history of the Spanish Civil War that was based on 2 years of interviews and over a year's work of transcription. The archives of his first book are in Liverpool, catalogued as a collection of 88 interviews, 80 audio cassette tapes, and transcripts of interviews, notes and correspondence, press cuttings, manuscript drafts of the books, and cassette recordings of the interviews. In America, there's almost certainly a similarly complex archive of materials behind Studs Terkel's 1974 Working People Talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. Terkel's book, according to Perry Anderson at least, was inspired by Fraser's series and became its own kind of sensation. What all these projects have in common is that they emphasize the mediation of the writer or filmmaker in making space in print or film or radio for working people to talk about their lives. But talking has very different affordances from writing. In some ways, it was more obvious to record the voices of real workers. It has been asked why, writes Fraser in his preface to the second series of the work essays, in originating these personal accounts, New Left Review did not use a tape recorder to record the experience of the less articulate, as the critics have put it. The choice of writing, he states there, has been deliberate. We did not want to introduce an outsider, an interviewer with a set of questions to whom subjects would necessarily have to react. In this sense, the work series, which asks workers to write in their own way of their work, shares a different lineage with a specific tradition of working class autobiography that is not the work of retrospect or recollection, but of workers who are still working in non-literary professions. Much of this kind of writing can be accounted for in material terms as having been written in the form of diaries kept, for instance, on Sundays, or in educational settings, or in moments snatched on the job. Bread, Knowledge and Freedom, David Vincent's classic account of 19th century British working class writing, was also an artifact of this moment of the 60s, and it recovers works on this basis as being written by people who were still working class. Most autobiographers, Vincent notes, in this classification wrote in their retirement once their working lives were over. The most immediate precedent for Fraser's work series, though, is the 1938 essay collection Seven Shifts. This was published by Jack Common, who's best known as a friend of George Orwell. In his preface, Common describes his collection as an attempt to bring together members of the literary bourgeoisie and the lad from the unprinted proletariat. Both parties talk well, he stresses, but the working class are mute as far as print goes. Common describes himself attempting with some difficulty to reverse this fact, sending out letters to his friends describing what he wanted of them with mixed results. So Common, unlike Fraser, is very explicit about how difficult it is to get working people to put down in writing their experiences of working. 2 complete manuscripts arrived promptly, he says. Also fragments accompanied by little pathetic notes that told of hard struggle on the distant front. Dear Jack, says one, I've done 3 pages and I've got naught more to say. It costs pints of mild and bitter, 1 shilling, 1 small players, total is 1 and 7. How much will 8,000 words work out at? A 3rd manuscript took another course. It was satisfactory, voluminous, and full of good stuff, but got up in a semi-fictional guise that didn't fit. Then came our first defeat. I got 3,000 words done, Jack, but it can't be helped. You know the way we live in this bloody tenement. While I was out, the baby got hold of the sheets and messed them up, so you'll have to count me out. Common's preface goes on to describe the challenge of getting his authors, all good talkers, to write anything down. I'm a laborer and I have to labor to live. It leaves me no time or energy for this game, one protests, even as the quality of the writing he gathers in is excellent. Seven Shifts explains its existence as a collection of pages fueled by beer and gathered in through sheer effort on Common's part. Its preface magnifies a backstory that many of the work essays also have. How did the worker in the car factory or the clerk at his desk manage to produce these pieces of beautifully written life writing? Many essays, Fraser acknowledges in his introduction to the second series in 1969, did not actually appear. For our part, he says, we regret, among others, the shop worker, the corporation executive, the process worker, and the immigrant, who for reasons of time were unable to write their essays. Going on, Fraser acknowledges that the series has failed on this account to address this question of time, a gulf between work and non-work that is in itself suggestive of the qualitative experience of most work situations. Whether a job is good, in other words, depends largely on whether there is any time outside of it, time that one might use, in this case, to write about it. To the extent that the work essays do anchor themselves in this availability of non-work time, it's not through their initial headnotes, which mostly suggest that working class writing is ripe for the harvesting. Many of the essays themselves do mention union involvement as a scene of education, and some mention the author's early love of schooling. But the initial headnotes in the New Left Review are written in a way that summarize and amplify the position of the author, rather than explain convincingly how the essay actually came to be written down. So this is what they look like. You've seen it in the one that's sent round. The headnote here to the convener. Oh no, this is from an earlier one. This is from 48. So the headnote reads, now in his early 40s, PH has been a communist since his youth and is a member of the AEU. And here, is the headnote in that format. So they look like this at the beginning. Is also written in the third person. Here's the headnote to the clerk, which is largely just a quotation from the essay itself. Unlike even the humblest worker on a production line, he doesn't produce anything. He battles with phantoms, abstracts, runs in a paper chase that goes on year after year and seems utterly pointless. How can there be anything else other than boredom in it for him? PC is a clerk and has worked in various offices for the last 15 years. He's also a writer and age 40 is married with a teenage daughter. So I'm going to come back to him, the clerk, in a minute. But I just want to point out here what these headnotes don't do, which is tell us how these people managed to actually write the essays that we're reading. The housewife. The lot of the housewife is one assiduously covered in the contemporary English novel, yet often in such accounts, plot demands often mask the housewife's actual work situation, and the blank patches are filled with action or profitable and readable meditations. The writer of the article that follows does not have to encounter such exigencies and presents the role of the housewife as it largely is, a ritual of tedium, subjugation, drudgery, and boredom, a ritual the majority of women must encounter. So the life of both of these essays, as well as another 11 of the original series in the New Left Review, extend beyond the journal itself. And this is where the headnotes are the thing that changes. In 1968, before the journal series had ended, Fraser published Work, 20 personal accounts in a Penguin imprint that was associated with the New Left Review and that would go on to become what we now know of as Verso. So in the, and I can pass these around too, because these are the two. One of them is the library copy of Work 1 and the other is my copy of Work 2. So you can see what they look like. So the volume, but Work 1, the first one, came out in 68 with a selection of the original essays. They didn't all make it into Work 1. And there were some new commissions, the doctor, the policeman, and the accountant. The volumes also commissioned new concluding essays. Work 1 has an essay by Raymond Williams, and work 2 has a concluding essay by Alvin Goldner. But okay. Both of the volumes had short opening statements by Fraser. In the preface to volume 1, Fraser quantifies the number of authors who are writing for publication for the first time, approximately half, which lines up with the professions, of course, that they have, and more or less the class profile of the authors. And he offers a glimpse here of the question that he's assigned to the authors when he gave them the original assignment of writing these essays, whether alienation from work lies in the job itself or in the capitalist social structure which assigns its purpose to work. But neither Fraser's preface to volume 1 nor Williams or Goldner's afterwards foregrounds the material difficulty that they've encountered in getting these non-literary folk to write about their own lives. Where the new collections and the new format for the essays shifts is that we no longer have those original headnotes. We now have endnotes that are appended to the original essays. And these appear in the work collections as biographical statements written now in the first person in terms that take account, where applicable, of the time that has passed since the original New Left Review versions of the essays were published and the time in which, and 68 and 69, which are the years that the essay collections have come out. So here, for instance, is Brian Slater's note, and the authors are now given their full names. He turns out to be, he's the author of On the Line. And here we learn that he's a member of the AAU, the Amalgamated Engineering Union, and of the Labour Party. And he hopes, he writes, that my daughter gets a better education than I did. I don't want her starting work at 15. My main pastimes are cooking, fishing, and reading. I've always wanted to know how to paint and to make pictures. So the notes take on this slightly more autobiographical and descriptive quality, and they account, I would say, almost all of them in some way for how the authors spend their time. In his new note, Dennis Johnson, author of that inaugural piece, Factory Time, writes more capaciously of his desires. Away from the factory, I like to be outdoors. Football in winter, cricket in summer. Most of my thoughts sprang from watching people. I wondered who they were, why they were doing what they were doing, why they seemed happier than me. The reason, I suspect, is because many of them didn't bother to read The Guardian or watch Panorama. I have a tendency to worry over things like Vietnam. Perhaps once a week I read a book, chosen not so much on literary merit as on what I mistakenly believe to be a portrayal of a way of life preferable to mine. I'm married with a baby daughter. For her, I have no ambitions, only hopes she will somehow be able to be an individual in a world of friendly individuals. Naive, perhaps, but truthful. But now comes the punchline. The note goes on. Since October 1965, after writing this article, I have been at Ruskin College, Oxford, studying literature. This is not totally unprecedented in Johnson's case. Johnson's original essay names a scheme introduced by the Workers' Education Association to buy factory workers out of their jobs one day a week to pursue liberal studies at the local adult education college. As Johnson writes the essay, he's been participating in what he calls institutional day release. Johnson stressed there in the essay that this is not a training scheme, not one designed to improve the employment prospects for the workers, but one in which workers are being paid to read and write in a deliberately non-utilitarian setting. His own desire, expressed in the biographical note in the book 4 years later, now echoes what he's learned in that program. When I finish, he writes, I want to teach, particularly to teach that good has more than a material meaning. The fact that the writers of the essays have gone on in the years that they wrote for the New Left Review to further study is a common theme. The 1968 note on Robert Pauley's Selling for a Living, originally published in 1965, states, I spent about 2 years of my working life in selling before going to teachers' training college. And the note to the housewife, which became a popular piece in feminist circles on both sides of the Atlantic after its first appearance, reads, since writing this essay, I've had another baby. Carl is 3 now and the baby 3 months. Joe and I are 27. I have started work on my thesis again, and we hope to go abroad as soon as this is possible. In volume 2, a new essay by a bricklayer contains an endnote describing the life of the bricklayer, and he is still a bricklayer, who's also taking extramural classes in current events and philosophy. This has led, he writes, to him taking his high school leaving certificate part-time, and he's hoping to go on to study a degree in sociology. The story these notes tell is partly a story of post-war British education having become more democratic and democratically accessible than in the interwar years of 7 shifts. These mini autobiographies speak to working lives shot through with educational opportunity for adults and with evidence of adult education feeding into and out of the essays themselves, in which work is described but also limned by the act of description itself, which is connected to writing outside of work and without professional ambition being its key purpose. There's also a story of state grants being given to working class writers, and to that opening up spheres of possibility that the essays themselves only hint at. My favourite example here is the clerk, Philip Callow, whose original piece, At the Office, was introduced as we saw, as an account of this endless and hopeless paper chase, so useless that it was less satisfying than factory work, which at least produced something. But in his new autobiographical note in Work 1, Philip Callow describes his commute to the office, the office job, which he still holds as he's writing in Devon. I leave home at 7:20, travelling by bus and ferry, and get back at 6:40 each evening. In the little leisure time I have, I read and write and hope one day to paint again. Now, this seems like a fairly unpromising life in terms of the possibility of writing, but his parting detail in this sense is a little bit mind-boggling. Since 1956, I have published 8 books, novels, short stories, essays, poetry, and I've had a play produced on TV. In December 1966, I was awarded an Arts Council bursary to enable me to devote all my time to writing for a little while. Those state bursaries offered in England throughout the 1960s were designed to buy writers, quote, time to concentrate on their craft for a period of time. December 1966, the date of Callow's grant, would have been 3 months after the publication of his New Left Review piece, although by that time he'd already written several autobiographical novels about working class life, many of which were critically recognised. The clerk, in other words, is also a writer. In Callow's sense, the most useless of jobs is not overcome, but balanced by its having such a substantial outside. Now, if this were a different kind of presentation, I would go here into a much longer account of the kind of writing on display in these work essays as state-sponsored in all the best ways, not because the New Left Review was state-sponsored as a journal, but because the workers it published were almost without exception recipients of state education and grants and courses and bursaries. They went to open university classes, they claimed state pensions, And because their skills and willingness to write of their own working class occupation can be tracked in material terms to the skills they cultivated in these spaces, it sits in this material space adjacent to their primary lines of employment. The investment of the state in workers' literacy was, it turns out, an important part of the story that these essays tell. They're not bootstrapped into existence or written in lunch breaks as the machinery runs. We can talk about that more if you want, as in terms of the sort of state origins of this kind of adult education in Britain at this time. But I want to end somewhere a little different with a point about book history. Book history has been for me, as for many others, I think, an important way to think and write about the history of work. Book historical projects tend to allow us to see the labor of the typist or the print setter or the illustrator concealed in the object that is too often misrecognized as the work of an author. This is the dictum that's kept me coming back to the archives and to places like material texts, and it's the one that remains fairly explicit, particularly, I'd say, now in queer and feminist and African-American book history projects. But the problem I've been tussling with in this talk is slightly different, for it asks that we make sense materially of writing as evidence of the time people have away from work. This involves methodologically a different approach from the one that most of us use as book historians, for it suggests that we look to writing on the page as part of a system of triangulation in which work is defrayed rather than simply always performed. What we need, I've been suggesting, is a way of tracing the distribution of factory work and housework and clerical work such that we might see the hands and thoughts of those normally doing that work as the same hands that are also freed up sometimes enough for them to pick up a pen. By this logic, while the text remains iceberg-like, the part of it that lies under the surface of the water contains not just the unseen work of editors and printers and translators, but also the work of the people who keep the factories running, the tracks on track, the trains on track, and the patients cared for while the writer writes. This work is adjacent to the act of writing, but it is connected to it by an inverse relation, one that makes the work essays an imprint of the time their authors have not been doing the things they write about. So I'm going to end now by saying quickly why I think this matters right now. As humanists, we've long been in the business of showing that what we do is work: the writing, the printing, the preserving, the cataloguing, the reading. To talk of these activities as work has felt like a way to defend them against funding cuts and the general disenfranchisement of the humanities in the educational landscape. But it has also left us vulnerable to the idea, so dominant now, that anything that is work might be done better by machines. This is especially true in these days we are living through right now of writing. Against our arguments for how much work writing is, to learn, to wield, to curate, to teach, the architects of LLMs can quite reasonably say that they have ways to lighten that load. But what if the premise was wrong? What if writing was always also the thing that workers wanted time off work to do, even when what they wrote about was work? These are the very big contours of the book project that I'm currently working on. So I don't know if they make sense in this condensed version, but for me, I love these New Left Review essays because they sort of make that case visible in such an immediate way. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. And if you're on Zoom, please raise your hand if you want to ask a question.
I think I've missed this. I'm curious about the way, if we know any of this at all, that these people were contacted for these essay collections and to be in the New Left Review. And I'm curious about that because the whole time I was thinking about how today so many people write really long form content on like Substack, even Reddit, other forums online alongside doing their day jobs. But it's kind of an amorphous sort of cloud of all these different people writing about their experiences. Compared to this organized, curated, and edited collection, these collections that you've drawn our attention to. So yeah, I was just wondering about how that process can.
Well, I did try and find this out. I talked to a couple of people who are still around, who were involved in the New Left Review at the time. And the answer was pretty much that the way in which those authors were chosen and solicited was pretty much the way it would happen if we were doing a collection like this now. Like, okay, I start with my friend who works in the post office, and, you know, then I go to my other friend who, you know, used to work at a factory, and we ask them if they know anyone. So, I mean, the common thread is that many of the authors, not all of them, and I think they became more diligent as it went on about not asking socialists, basically trying to diversify and have some non-socialists. But the common thread would be people who have had some involvement with their labor unions. So the union involvement was an important way, and I suspect, and the people I talked to also suspected, that Fraser often went through the union reps to ask if there was anyone in the union at a particular workplace who might have some interest in literacy. But Ariel, I totally agree that the contemporary sort of landscape is dotted with interesting examples of exactly this kind of formation, where people are in fact using writing to relax and to participate in the public sphere and to develop as individuals and to exercise their own sort of political rights. All of these things are happening in the space of writing that is visible to us as we sort of browse through Substack stacks and look on social media. I think it's everywhere. The idea that writing for many people is a way to offset their jobs rather than to do them. Yeah.
Davida and Jerry.
I taught writing to college students for about 40 years. And for a certain set of classes, I used to ask these students to do writing autobiographies, what they remember or think about, how they learned to read and write, and what writing and reading activities they had done over the years. And the kind of writing that most of them talked about as voluntary writing outside of school was poetry, songwriting, narratives, not too surprisingly, because those were the types of genres that they were also, encountering the most. But there's also, so they're not writing about, they didn't have jobs, work of that sort, but there was this sense of creativity that they wanted to, some outlet for that. And then I think about George Plimpton's Paris Review series of interviews about writers talking about their own writing. And what happens in some of this discussion of what we valorize as creative writing is that there's this aura, this sort of romanticism, this aura of genius, the fairy dust that gets sprinkled on some people and not others. And even the students themselves felt that what they were doing was in some way illegitimate because they didn't have that, whatever that is. So what I found fascinating about your talk is that, there isn't that kind of self-consciousness, that I mean, it's not, I only saw a couple of examples, but it doesn't seem like being asked to write is being asked to take on a task that requires a certain amount of talent, genius, whatever that is. It's not a question.
No, it's not a question. I mean, for me, what it brings out is something. I mean, I've thought about this a lot because I, encounter so often people saying, well, they can't, they can't write anymore. So, I mean, if our students can't write anymore, then obviously the people working down the road in the Amazon warehouse can't write anymore either. And we couldn't ask them to write about what it means to work in the Amazon warehouse because they've been totally robbed of this skill set, which seems to be in evidence as evidence here, basically, of a pretty effective, if nothing else, sort of British comprehensive school system, right?
Yes.
But on the other hand, as Ariel just said, there's the world is seething with evidence of the fact that people can still write and do write, and that, amazing novels are being written right now by people who work in Amazon warehouses. So it's a little bit complicated, the story that we want to tell here about the role of writing, I think, as something adjacent to people's main lines of work.
I thought that was related to what you were saying, and then I'll go to Jerry and Julia, promise. Which is the writing that was being sought out from these people was autobiographical writing about a specific topic, but there's also a whole world of writing that I feel like working class people were doing, and that especially with typewriters and carbon copies and then things like mimeographs was very widely available, which was things like the newsletter for your parish church or a hobbyist thing like your football supporters newsletter, right? Or whatever kinds of, like all the zines that started in the 60s, Star Trek zines. And these are written by
certainly the stuff of the trade unions, right?
And then trade union newsletters. There's a lot of writing there, right? So there's this kind of writing that isn't valorized in the same way. That's kind of quote unquote functional writing, but also is often pleasure writing, like for hobbyists things that, is done in spare time and done for free and done for no reason. Especially not the organizational newsletters, but things like a newsletter about your football club, right? And I wonder if, is that something in the background of these people's lives, or that is, forms of writing that are not thought of as writing always.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the case of these essays, I mean, just the empirical evidence for how these people have learned to write so well, I think points to the fact that most of them have been, or many of them have been, either they've been good students at school, or they've been very active members of their trade unions, which is where a lot of them describe the real pleasure of their lives and their work life. But yes, there are also some examples in those autobiographical notes of people saying, yes, and I run the, I run the opera society in, my part of London. So the fact that these are people who see writing as a form of pleasure and validation, and are in some ways tapping into that pleasure in these kind of work adjacent spaces generally, I think that it does move. It goes beyond the pleasure of autobiography. It is, I think, more about the sort of graphology aspect of it as well.
So, thank you, Tina. This was great. As you were speaking about these publications, I was thinking about another British product that was, I guess, roughly contemporaneous, and that was the Up movies, 7 Up, 14 Up, so forth, where people are which are ostensibly about the British class system. I mean, they're documentary auto presentations, but they're very much about the British class system. And you have working class kids and adults, and you have upper crust people. And the meaning of the movies comes from the entirety of them. The examples that you gave were, except for the editor who was kind of self-pitying, although accurate. That's what working class do. There's the housewife who may not be working class, but is describing domestic drudgery. You have the clerk, you have the factory worker, the night watchman, all jobs that, like, a priori we can assume are like mind-numbing and alienating. But in the mix, there's also an actor, a research scientist, an architect, a surgeon, a scenic designer, a creative. I'm wondering how, if you look at those texts, do those give a different sense of work and the relationship of the individual to work, or is the overall editorial project one that is kind of deterministic and will say, look, even the scenic artist is alienated from his work, even this research scientist, university educated research scientist is alienated from work. So what is the larger picture of these when you don't focus on working class people who are in what we might assume are like mind-numbing jobs?
I mean, the Raymond Williams essay that is appended to the first volume basically does, I guess, make the most of that sort of diversity by saying, isn't it surprising that the pleasure doesn't come from where you think it would? That it turns out that selling he's like, there's this amazing array here of all these different sort of professional points of view. Isn't it interesting that the person who works in advertising copy, it feels a lot more alienated than the bricklayer, who actually has a pretty good account of the meaningfulness of laying bricks. So Raymond Williams works with that, and he's like, isn't it interesting to put us all in the same room as workers and do away with our sort of preconceptions about what work is good work, and try and work this out in a sort of more just start from the basic conditions of the basic questions about what it would be to not feel alienated, and then to think about that from across without these preconceptions of class. I think in terms of APTA's project, it is pretty it is obviously, it's part of the same moment. And I think you could say that APTA is up to something similar in the sense that although that those very rich people are not the happy ones in that series. The very poor people aren't either. But in a way, that series is out to sort of disturb our idea that it would be better to be a lawyer than, to be a housewife.
Yeah, actually, the poor people are jollier.
They are, but they're certainly nicer.
Yeah.
Yeah, although they're also the ones. I love that series. So.
I love it too, but I don't.
They're the people who have learned certain tropes to say, such as, isn't it surprising that the people who are wealthy are not happier than the people who are not wealthy? The wealthy people don't say that.
The wealthy people don't say
They don't say, oh, I wish I was poor, because they're happier. But the working class people have certain lines that you get the feeling are not completely spontaneously generated, because they all kind of say similar things, which is like, money doesn't make you happy, and I'm just a simple person, but I have this happy life. In other words, I don't know how much the films, they try to kind of like suggest that too. So it kind of raises the question too of like how much writing into a certain cultural script are people doing in these essays, and how much is like, you've already raised this in other ways, like, is this a kind of genuine voice of the working class, or are these people who have been chosen because they're unusual, and they're friends of Perry Anderson or someone, you know, they're not sort of.
They're friends of Perry Anderson, but I think that, you know, that Ronald Fraser's using his own networks to find these people. I mean, it's not a
random sound.
not a but neither is apt to
No.
entirely. Yeah.
And
Sorry, Julia.
do you have a sense of how heavily edited
Yeah.
they were?
Yeah.
I mean, they obviously were edited. I don't know. I've asked this question to people, and I mean, people have said, I mean, they weren't. They are quite distinct. The voices are quite distinct. They haven't been homogenized in any way. So, and they haven't been edited. They don't get edited between their appearance in the New Left Review and their appearance in the collection. Apart from the changing of the head notes to the end notes. So I think, I mean, I think Fraser has quite a light hand, actually. I don't think they're heavily edited. I think the editing, as Zach's suggesting, goes more into the choice of people for whom writing is already a strong enough practice that you can count on them to produce these things. Yeah.
Wait, Julia, and then Peter on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. It sparked so much. I'm looking at the 1960s documentary context, so there's just so many overlaps, which are really fascinating. I love how this period in the New Left Review kind of brings up and in a way almost answers this kind of dichotomy and contradiction between the intellectual and the worker from the early 1920s in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And it kind of rejects that, right, by placing them in the same context as how everyone was talking about. There's also so much kind of parallel with direct cinema in North America and the way that people were in the same instance trying to pretend that documentary could be unmediated, right? That there was some kind of way that if we just use enough technology, we don't have to have the mediation of someone else going in and kind of disturbing things, which of course is impossible, right? But it's kind of aligning with that, which is really interesting. My question is actually more about the form of these books. Obviously I know the New Left Review, but I am thinking more in relation to like cinema journalism in France at this exact time, which has started getting rid of any ornament at all. Which kind of begs the question of like, who is reading this, and it is actually at the same time that the workers, in a grand scheme of things, their understanding of work might actually kind of be rejected by the form of this journal, which does seem pretty ascetic, and then kind of to this day, like there's no ornamentation, not that every worker just wants ornament, obviously, but like compared to other journals, and especially compared to Verso today, right, they seem so austere. And I'm just kind of wondering whether there was any work done on this, and why, is the reader of these actually often the worker, and what that has to do with like Verso now is this like more sparkly fun and look at our cool covers, but the New Left Review is not. So I'm kind of like curious about this idea of ornament and what that has to do with leftism.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that the New Left Review is strikingly unornamental for a journal of its time?
Yeah, I don't know. I think compared to other journals I've seen, but maybe that's not true in the UK. I just don't know the context, I think. And I'm kind of more looking at it from like visual studies, but more, I guess maybe my question is more along the line of who was reading this?
Who were the subscribers to the New Left Review? Yeah, I mean, I think that the subscribers to the New Left Review ran the full gamut of people who were interested in I mean, it obviously crossed over, but I mean, there was a genuine crossover between people who were involved as socialists in their labor unions and saw themselves as socialists in political contexts, and this academic socialist group, I would say. I mean, it did have that crossover. I mean, that was its political commitment, and that also I think would show up if we had access to the full subscription list from its 1960s run. Don't know quite how to justify my feeling that that is the case. Although, you know, looking through issues of the New Left Review from this period, you can see that the kind of advertisements for the kind of events that are advertised there include sort of, you know, socialist workshops for workers and trade unionists, as well as, you know, the new Lacan conference collection or essay translation that's coming out. So there is a crossover in who's reading it. And I don't know about its austerity. I mean, I just don't know. Well, I just don't know, I guess, is what I would say. I mean, it's relative. I mean, the fact that it's relatively cheap for a journal is probably an important aspect of its distribution. So including like color images or something would have changed its price bracket. I mean, that's not
more subtle things. Like I noticed this in the context of France, where it's like the era of graphic design, but it's like actually rejecting like the little tiny little, you know, Mark McLuhan era. These little, it's really subtle, but I think it's
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Peter, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Tina. That was really a wonderful talk. I have something just to say. I mean, there were incredible tensions. I walked into the 70s within New Left Review, and the main tension was around oral history in many ways. And the oral history tradition carried on, but above all through Ruskin College and the History Workshop Journal. So History Workshop Journal came to represent much more a close connection to the trade union movement. Most of the people who really set up the History Workshop Journal were people who were associated with the unions originally. They'd gone through Ruskin College. And Ralph Samuel was the person who was the most significant. He was a crossover figure because he was highly interested in theory, but his great oral history, which is East End Underworld, and this is the question, anyway, I do have a question here, which is that in some ways, what he discovered in East End Underworld was that these very elderly people, criminals, really were massive readers of Dickens, and they'd actually often shaped their life around Dickens, just as mafia people shape their lives around the Godfather. You know, so they were sort of thinking about this. And so for Raff, one of the things that was so important is he would have recognized what Dennis Johnson said, which is rather awkward. He says that Dennis Johnson liked to read, and I quote, "a portrayal of a way of life preferable to mine." It was the last thing he wanted to do was to write about his own life or even to read about his own life. What he wanted to read, and this is what Roger Chartier has written a lot about, the Bibliothèque Bleue, and, you know, in the 18th century, people are reading these fables of aristocrats, you know, which is kind of ludicrous at one level, but they're imagining in a very broad way. And when Raff really pushed his direction, I worked with him on our popular culture group, and we did conferences on romance and on detective fiction. We couldn't be further removed from doing work. Do you know what I mean? I mean, what we were interested, and of course that was very complicated because it actually turns out that lots of what was being discovered at the same time, lots of middle-class people are reading romance fiction, and you know, you think of the extent to which, and writing it too, you know, so that they're often educated people, both with university degrees, and the same with detective fiction. So they are massively popular, but the question really is then for me is, to what extent is part of the problem is that there was a kind of push from the left all through the 60s and 70s that you should write about the actual conditions. So it's a paradox. So you have high theory on the one hand, but on the other hand, the notion you really want the nitty gritty. And that came out with a book called A Good Night Out, which was really saying we shouldn't be giving people a good night out. We should be, challenge them in a Brechtian way every night. But the problem with that is that when these people, when they're writing, they describe choices. They describe the choice between fishing, cooking, reading a book, writing. They're all options you might do. What's so brilliant about your work, Tina, is you actually open up that space, which is what is it you do when you don't work? And is writing really a kind of work? And should we validate it that way? But many of these people do think of writing along with fishing, cooking, reading is the other sort of big thing.
Painting. A lot of them say they paint.
Yeah.
Which I found
Absolutely.
fascinating.
Absolutely. And the same with retirement. Lots and lots of people pick up, lots of people pick up painting when they retire. My mother did, so I'm just saying it. But I'm thinking in a way there was a kind of a Puritanism, even though I think it's wonderful. I love the stuff you read. I think it's wonderful. We do need to know accounts of people's working lives. But many of those people would not end up, once they'd had higher education, some of them become sociologists. One of them actually said that I want to do sociology. So then study, people, how they work. But lots of people want to write romance fiction. Lots of people in the academy now are actually beginning to write romance fiction. A huge number, a staggering number. So the question there is a way, the tension in a way between the need to have a kind of political account of actual people working, what it means to work, what it means to be in a factory, what it means. And of course, for academics, most of us, it is work. I mean, literally, we're paid to write, essentially. We are paid to write. I mean, to get tenure, you have to publish. And so it feels to most young academics that I know, it feels absolutely like work. And so it's a pleasure when you get to my age and you're retired. You don't give a shit about that anymore. No one gives a shit whether you, and so it becomes pleasure again. It becomes actually something you might want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks, Peter. I mean, everything that you said resonates with stuff that I've been thinking about. I mean, I think in relation to this project, as I've, given talks from it and talked about people, I mean, people often ask quite reasonably, well, if you're interested in what people do outside work, why don't you look? I mean, the last place you should be looking is to, these kind of dull autobiographical accounts of people's life, because people write poetry and romance and, all the stuff that you've just said. And I think that is true when it comes to thinking about how writing has been part of a history of not working. You certainly wouldn't be necessarily looking to these kinds of autobiographical accounts, which are in a way a very artificial and sort of, as you say, paradoxically very bourgeois demand from why would we want to know about these kinds of things other than because we were asking from a really bourgeois perspective about what it actually was like to be in the factory. But I would say that as academics, it is kind of on us to account for the slightly trickier fact that these sort of documents, which suggest in a way that they've been squeezed or extracted directly from the workplace as sort of evidence of workers' consciousness, are in fact evidence, I think, of not work rather than of work. That I would say would be the academic move in this project. That does require some sort of literary sensibility to make that move, because to read them at face value is to read them as evidence of lives spent working. But actually, I'm trying to read them as evidence. I mean, to stick with the evidential, to read them as evidence of lives in which there was room for something other than working, where the written document becomes evidence of that. And in terms of this is also to sort of follow through on a sort of more literary point, but I think in terms of what writing does as just one of those things you could do after work, you could take up cooking classes, you could, take up painting, you could do pottery. Like, what are we all going to do after the revolution? Let's all think about it. We're going to do different things, right? It's going to be fun. But we don't know what fun it is. And probably only some of us are going to want to continue writing the academic study that we have on our, hard drive at the moment. But the point is, I think that writing about one's life introduces a kind of fold that is, in literary terms, evident as the difference between the thing that you're writing about and the space in which you're writing about it. So painting doesn't necessarily do that. Cooking certainly doesn't, but writing does. So in order to write about work, you have to be not working. In order to write about looking after a baby, you have to be not holding that baby. So there is writing is a kind of space of bifurcation. It is itself a sort of a form of bifurcation that I think introduces something close to the life that most people want, which is a life in which you have time to work and also time to step back from work and think about, or maybe even act on the thoughts that you have about the work that you do. And so writing is a very special kind of activity in that sense, that it doesn't express directly one's experience. So these are not sociological points, these are literary points. But I think I'm trying to respond to why. I think the study of how working class people engage with fantasy and romance and all kinds of other writing is completely fascinating. And I know that Ralph Samuels was doing that and Alison Light was doing. This moment people were really thinking about that. Jan Radway was doing that. This is all great stuff, but there is something theoretically very, very interesting to me about the production of these kinds of accounts of work that could be confused if one didn't read them carefully for evidence of work, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
No, that's really interesting. I'm tempted to stop there, but we're going to take Emil's question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had sort of small question about the name changes. I was really struck by the anonymity that we see in the magazine. And I'm wondering if we can talk about this too as maybe a product of the materiality, right? If this is a more tenuous position to be in a magazine that's being distributed. Because on the one hand, there are many ways to take this, but part of this anonymity, what also struck me about these jobs is that they were vague enough that they couldn't be located back to a specific place, right? A specific company. But also that this anonymity also offers the opportunity for, quote, the bricklayer to be speaking for all instead of the self, as if this is everybody's experience of bricklaying, as if everybody feels that they are directly connected to history. That seems to me like a kind of fantasy, as we've been talking about in print. And it ironically strips the nuances of the work in this way. But maybe I just want to hear your thoughts on being anonymous in a magazine and maybe having the safety of an anthology that's published by Penguin Books.
Well, it's a boring answer, but my assumption in thinking about that has been that the people who were somehow sort of uncomfortable about what they were doing fell out of didn't make it into the final collection. I think, the ones that aren't in the collections aren't necessarily weaker or obviously less interesting. So I think there were some people who were like, no, I don't want to go further with this. So I think the ones that were happy to have them included in the collection were the people who were also happy to put their names to them. But
They're becoming public.
So they were becoming published authors. And then they also had that opportunity to sort of give that little sort of viewpoint from 3 or 4 years down the road of themselves in a new light as people who'd authored this piece and gone on in some way to expand the territory that had facilitated the authoring of that piece, which is what those endnotes in the collection become. So yeah, I think those people were moving in some way, not necessarily towards upward mobility or professionalization. In some cases, yes, but I don't think that's the headline here. But they were, as you say, moving towards authorship.
Right.
And that is what the naming of them, and then also the involved that they were also then collecting royalties from the collection, right? So they, yeah.
And the shift from third to first person is very emblematic of that.
Yes, exactly.
All right, let's do one last question.
I just had one comment because I come to this from the world of work. Maybe I would have been somebody they could have interviewed or asked to write something, but when you describe you have to be outside of work to be writing about work, these people have turned their work into like a work in progress, if you want to use that. And they've made themselves into something that's growing and developing instead of just being
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
work as an end in itself, because you could very well see all of them hired in their job, and they are. A lot of them are extremely frustrated, but by reflecting on it, you brought out that they want to transform that, make it into something else. And I thought that was a very powerful message that you gave.
Yeah, and I think that is right. I mean, that's very it's very intuitively accurate if you to describe that, because I think that there is a sense, if one were to read all of these essays with that in mind, you can see that in many of them, people are really trying to cultivate a sense, not necessarily that they've outgrown their jobs or that they've left their jobs behind, because in most cases that's not true, but that they've grown in consciousness, maybe even in the process of writing that essay about the different stages of their own life's work. And so there is something like evidence of writing itself as a sort of laboratory for the growth of consciousness.
The reflection, the opportunity to reflect.
To make connections and draw. They draw, they're very clever essays. I mean, people have very smart things to say about their own lives in these essays, I think.
Well, we'll stop there. Thank you for that. Wonderful.